Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back after your extensive box lunch. I hope it was enjoyable. We are going to move on this afternoon to look at accountability, remedies, solutions, some of the things we started discussing this morning. But inevitably, speakers will be looking at the underlying facts and the investigations, because you can't look at the solutions without knowing what you're talking about. My name is Rodney Dixon. I'm a barrister practicing in international law from London, but in a lot of other places. And as a practitioner, I focus specifically on looking at ways in which victims or those directly affected can pursue justice, together with a lot of other things. But that's one of the key areas that I work on. It's, to say in a few words, a incredibly challenging process, which has to take place at so many different levels and in different forums. I often liken it to a stalactite and stalagmite project. You're in a dark cave, these rocks slowly growing together, sort of drip effect, taking so long, and then occasionally you have a massive surge and they get closer together. But I always reassure myself that in the end they do connect, even in the dark, and that down the road this can happen. But it is an incremental process, and we are very, very, at this stage, in the infancy, in a primitive stage of its development. When I was in the office of the prosecutor at the Yugoslav Tribunal, when it first started out in 1993, you may recall that the Srebrenica massacre took place in 1995 while the court was in existence. The Rwanda genocide took place a year later. A court hadn't been established yet. But many people say, well, then what is the point of all of this? How does it actually work? Does it have any deterrent effect? And I always emphasize, well, of course at that stage it didn't, because you hadn't had anything in place since Nuremberg. You'd had the Cold War. No one actually thought any of these things were going to bite. But maybe now, after you've had those courts, you've had other specialized, internationalized courts, you've got the ICC, you've got increased focus on universal jurisdiction, which I'm sure we're going to hear about. You've got other UN forums, you've got other ad hoc investigations like in Yemen, like in Syria, like in Iraq, coming out because of this push for justice for the victims. Maybe now people will be a little bit more concerned. You can't expect it to have a direct impact overnight. I mean, can you imagine if in our national jurisdictions the police said, well, we're only going to investigate people who live in this area for some of the time if we get evidence. I mean, no one's going to take the laws on murder and theft seriously if you really thought that it was going to be so selective, depend on so many factors out of your control. Of course, the human psyche is going to tend towards thinking, well, we can get away with this, can't we? And that's what's been happening for so long. It continues now. Impunity was highlighted in Ambassador Rapp's speech earlier on, and the whole point of this discussion now is to try and focus on how do you close the impunity gap at all these different levels and get that connection that I was talking about. We've got three very experienced experts today to talk to us from their different perspectives. What I'm going to do to save time is just introduce them briefly and then let them go one after the other, and then leave as much time at the end for questions, because we have to finish at 1:30, and I do want to make sure all those people who have been trying to ask get a chance to ask and have more discussion. The first speaker is Sarah Lee Whitson, who is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch for the Middle East and North Africa Division. Obviously has focused on this conflict extensively, looked at various of the violations, both those committed during the armed conflict, airstrikes, also detention offences, secret prisons run by the UAE, and a whole range of violations, which she's going to talk about from their own investigative experience and what they've been able to discern about the trends. Secondly, we have Walid El-Hariri, who is the director of the US office of the Sana Center for Strategic Studies. We'll also be talking from experience from the ground, but also looking at the mechanisms and remedies that are in place through the UN and other means as well. And then lastly, we have Don Picard, who's the chief legal advisor of the Yemen Peace Project. and he's also a partner at Picard Kenson Rowe, has practiced extensively, but through this project has focused on Yemen, trying to push it up the agenda. And I'm hoping we'll talk about the work that they've undertaken, what they've been able to find, and the very practical and concrete steps that can be taken, including through proceedings in our national courts and internationally as well. The last speaker, Raja from Amnesty International, unfortunately has not been able to get here, but that leaves us more time, that's the positive side, to go through what the speakers are going to say and have questions. I'm going to start with Sarah, who's also got some videos to show, so that might take a bit more time. I understand that they might not always be heard on the streaming. They will be. So those following from outside, you will be able to see and listen to the videos. So I'll hand over to Sarah first. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to lecture here today. I've been asked to discuss the investigations that international and Yemeni organizations have conducted to investigate abuses in Yemen, covering both violations of human rights law and international humanitarian law, and what these investigations have found. Just by way of background, with respect to my own organization, we have been very, very active in Yemen since 2005, although in doing a little research, I saw our first report on Yemen in 1994. Yemen was not a country that we worked on extensively between those years, for no other reason than a lack of resources to dedicate a researcher to that country. But the country came into increased focus around 2005, 2006 because of U.S. military operations there against AQAP, including the return of many Guantanamo detainees to Yemen. And as we started increasingly focusing on Yemen, our own focus turned to the Saleh government's conflicts with the Houthis in the north and the southern separatists in the south. As I think the prior panelists were discussing, the conflict in Yemen is sadly one that has been going on for a very long time, if not on the scale that we're seeing now. But this is when we started to establish very close relations with Yemeni civil society groups, journalists, activists, scholars, and representatives of the various political factions in the country, including President Saleh's GPC, the military, the militias that operated in parallel with the military, the Islah Party, which was perhaps the leading opposition party to the GPC, the Southern Separatist movement, and the Houthis in the north. Soon after the Arab uprisings made their way to Yemen in 2011, we intensified our coverage of the country with a dedicated Yemen researcher as the government began to confront nonviolent protesters demanding reforms with extreme violence, killing over 350 at the very outset of protesters. By 2012, we opened an office in Sana'a where our researcher and our Yemeni research assistant became permanently based for several years. And we closed our office only following the Houthi coup in mid-2015 because of the extreme insecurity in the country at the time, as fighting soon broke out in the capital. Nevertheless, we continued to return to the country regularly to carry out investigations on the ground throughout the country with researchers and the various Human Rights Watch staff, including myself, returning multiple times every year to conduct investigations into the abuses of the ongoing war. I mention all of this because I think it will help you understand the question I've been asked here today, which I take as, well, how do you conduct your investigations? The best way for us to conduct our investigations is to be on the ground, to talk to a wide variety of witnesses directly, to gather physical evidence, to take photographs and videos, to examine munitions, to inspect the area, and to try to determine what happened in assessing whether there's been a violation of law. But we can also gather information remotely if we have to, thanks to the fact that over our many years of work in Yemen, we have a very extensive network of contacts in the country from all segments of society, from all political perspectives in the country, and our deep familiarity working on the ground in Yemen. I raise all of this background because one of the most common defenses, and I'm putting those in air quotes for those who are not here, I've heard to our investigations is, well, how do they know? They're not on the ground. Oh, they're just reporting from New York and so forth. Well, we have been on the ground and continue to return to the ground as best we are able, hopefully returning this month in July, despite the very deliberate efforts of the Saudi coalition to keep us out of the country. An increasing strategy we're seeing throughout the Middle East is to keep investigators out. They're keeping us out of Sinai, they're keeping us out of Gaza, they're keeping us out of Yemen, just to name a few examples. And even when we have more infrequently gathered information remotely, as we've done in Syria or Afghanistan, just to list a few cases, or Sinai, we are rigorous in our methodology and verifications and stand by our work. None has been proven inaccurate. With respect to our findings, I want to give you a summary of what our investigations, which have looked at all parties to the conflict as a matter of principle, have found. First, with respect to the Saudi-led coalition violations, because these have been responsible for the vast majority of killings. As of April 2018, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights had verified that 6,300 civilians had been killed, 9,900 wounded since March 2015. We are very, very certain that the actual number of deaths and injuries due to this war is much, much higher, because these tallies literally only count the number of verified deaths from a direct attack, as opposed to, for example, someone dying from disease or injury months after an attack. In March of this year, the High Commissioner found that Saudi coalition airstrikes were responsible for over 61% of all the verified civilian casualties. Since the start of the war, Human Rights Watch has documented 87 apparently unlawful coalition attacks, which have killed nearly 1,000 civilians. So a large fraction of the numbers of civilians killed, including 241 children. The UN, High Commissioner for Human Rights, the panel of experts, the UN Security Council's investigative body, the UN Human Rights Council's investigative body, have also investigated dozens more strikes. At this point, we estimate that probably 120 to 150 strikes, airstrikes, have been examined. These coalition airstrikes, as I've mentioned, have killed hundreds of civilians and hit civilian areas, including markets, schools, hospitals, and homes. This includes, most significantly, in terms of the discussion on accountability and impunity, 6 unlawful strikes, for example, between June and August 2017, just a 3-month period after the coalition promised to tighten its rules of engagement. Just those 6 strikes, those 6 unlawful strikes that we investigated, killed 55 civilians, including 33 children, hitting multiple family homes, and in one case, killing 14 members of the same family. What our investigation has found is that some of these coalition attacks may amount to war crimes. In one of the most shocking and egregious examples, just because there really was absolutely no even purported military justification for it, in March 2017, a coalition airstrike, a helicopter attacked a boat filled with fleeing Somali refugees and migrants, including women and children, and killed at least 33 people. We have documented as well 18 different cluster munition attacks that have wounded 74 civilians and killed 21. Now, as you might understand, the 18 cluster munition attacks are not all of the cluster munition attacks that have taken place, but they are the ones that we have documented. Together also with Amnesty International, we have documented the use of cluster munitions made by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Brazil. The coalition admitted using British and American cluster munitions, but in December 2016, it promised to stop using British cluster munitions. But then just after that, we documented coalition attacks using Brazilian cluster munitions. Now, as you may know, cluster munitions are an unlawful weapon because they're inherently indiscriminate. There is a global convention banning the use of cluster munitions, which Saudi Arabia and Yemen are sadly not parties to. But nevertheless, as an indiscriminate weapon, and a weapon that leaves unexploded ordnances, we consider their use a very severe and serious violation of the laws of war. I want to show you now a short film on the use of cluster munitions, both because of the subject matter, but also because I think it will give you a sense of how we are able to gather the evidence of the use of cluster munitions.
القرية اللي في القرية ماتوا منهم 4 نفر والجرحى أكثر عن 15.
We have found evidence that ground-launched cluster munition rockets have been used in attacks against at least 7 locations in northern Yemen. Most likely these rockets were launched from Saudi Arabian territory. Cluster munitions are bombs or rockets that explode in the air and then disperse many smaller bombs over a wide area. Weapons used in these particular attacks were US-made M26 rockets, each of which contain 644 submunitions. And that means that any civilian in the impact area is likely to be injured or killed. And at least 13 civilians were killed and dozens injured in the attacks that we documented.
قريب من مجتمع نساء وسقطت علينا الصاروخ جرح في الجو واتفلت منا قنابل عنقودي وحنا قدام ما نروح بالغنم عدنا في البيت فلتت عندنا 2 انتشرت القنابل في القرية فلتت عندنا 2 جرحا واحدة عاد هاي لحد الآن تجرس أنا وبني عمي
ماتوا 3 2 طفال وواحد كبير أصلا ضربنا احنا رقادة واحنا تجرحنا احنا اخوتي كامل كسرت شلني لمي بس خرجني تغسلني شلني شلل اخويا ذي شلت كسر مني وكذي وحرقني وثوبي حرق ذاك الليلة وإيدي مني حرقان واشتغل مني العظام كلها تفسخان ومني.
The submunitions in this particular cluster munition rocket also have a high failure rate, which means that many of the submunitions fail to explode when they hit the ground and they become de facto landmines that can explode if civilians touch them. We found such unexploded submunitions in 3 locations that we visited. In one place, we found 3 of them in farming land in just a matter of minutes, and we almost stepped on one of them because it was almost completely covered by shifting sand.
هذا واحد وهذا واحد وهذا واحد هذا المنطقة كلها كامل ملقمة ألغام عنقودية وبس الناس قد صوبوا منها في حتى إبل قد ماتت واحدة إبل منها.
Local residents also showed us photographs of unexploded submunitions and remnants of munitions that they had collected in other locations.
هذا حق القنابل العنقودية، القنابل العلج حق هذا مركب في العلج حق القنبلة، تمام؟ وطوالي هي تنزل طوالي تقرب، بس هذا اتصل منه قرحان وهذا راح لحاله من القنبلة. بقي هذا الحال، لقيت هذا جيت أخش البيت كله قنابل. أجيت أشلت هذا معي بس أشوف له أوري أبوه الأم أقول له شوف القنابل المحرمة ضربونا بها هذه القنابل.
Neither Yemen, Saudi Arabia, nor the other coalition states have joined the 2008 treaty that bans the use of cluster munitions. But these weapons should never be used under any circumstances because of the harm that they cause to civilians, both during the attack and afterwards. The 117 countries that have signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions should condemn this use and call on all the parties to the conflict in Yemen to also sign the treaty. And the United Nations Human Rights Council should create a commission of inquiry to investigate laws of war violations by all parties in Yemen.
One of the reasons why Human Rights Watch has called for an arms embargo to the parties to this conflict, in particular the Saudi coalition, and the reason why we believe the U.S. is a party to this war, not only because U.S. weapons are predominantly being used by the Saudi coalition in this war in, for example, 87 apparently unlawful coalition attacks, but also because we believe the U.S. is a party to the war in providing targeting assistance, apparently not very good targeting assistance, as well as refueling support for Saudi coalition aircraft. I want to just show you a very brief clip on, for example, the use of American-made weapons.
يعني الساعة 3 إلى 5 فجرا وأنا جالس في الكنتيرة هذه سمعت الضربة خرجت بيتصلوا لي قالوا ضربوا الحفاء الناس كده فقد راسه وناس بعض أعضاء جسمه يعني رجل أيديه.
بعدها طلعنا الصبح الساعة 9 وصلنا ربينا وقدرنا السنة مفحمين كمبرنا شوية جمعوا الناس والطائرة وصلت ضربت بين الناس والناس الذي هرب والذي توفى والذي جرح لا عندنا مواقع ولا عندنا أي حاجة وإنما إحنا مزارعي بعد حالنا نحفر لنا بير نتزرع ونشرب ماء وهم جو يعتدوا علينا هكذا.
In parallel with the indiscriminate airstrikes that have characterized the Saudi coalition's military operations in the country, the coalition has also violated the laws of war by restricting humanitarian assistance and destroying objects essential to the survival of the civilian population, such as food, medicine, and fuel. This, of course, is part of its wide-scale siege of air and land ports into the country. And these violations, as well as the coalition's disregard for the reported suffering of the civilian population, suggest that the coalition may also be violating the prohibition against using starvation as a method of warfare, which is a war crime. The Saudi coalition has eased some restrictions of its siege and closure of all of Yemen, but the uncertainty around access makes it extremely difficult and costly for commercial importers to reach Houthi-controlled ports in particular. The ongoing fight for Hodeidah will undoubtedly make this worse, and I just want to reemphasize, if it wasn't emphasized this morning, that Yemen is a country that imports the vast majority of its fuel and the vast majority of its foods and nearly all of the medicine in the country. The coalition has also refused to allow commercial flights to Sana'a since August 2016. As of mid-May of last year, the coalition also banned human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch from taking UN flights into Yemen. This makes it extremely difficult to reach areas where airstrikes are happening now. Journalists' access onto these flights has also been blocked, and I think you can see why. This evidence is really pretty damning. These restrictions, coupled with the Houthis also impeding the flow of aid, have exacerbated the world's largest humanitarian catastrophe, a catastrophe that has surpassed even the suffering in Syria. In numbers, for example, 75% of the population needs humanitarian assistance and protection. 8.5 million people are on the brink of starvation. Nearly 3 million women and children are acutely malnourished. Less than 50% of the country's health facilities are functioning. 2 million people are displaced. There has been an unprecedented outbreak of cholera and diphtheria. This is why the Saudi coalition has, as of today, again found itself on the UN Security Council's list of shame for the world's worst abusers of children. With respect to the United Arab Emirates, our investigations have found them responsible for forced disappearances, torture, and arbitrary detentions. As you may already know by now, the UAE funds, arms, trains, and directs Yemeni forces, including Yemeni militias that operate outside of the control of the Yemeni government they are purportedly trying to support. Last year, we found that they arbitrarily detained, forcibly disappeared, tortured, and abused dozens in southern and eastern Yemen. The UAE also runs its own detention facilities, which have been subject to rampant abuse allegations. The United States, of course, is working very closely with the UAE in counterterrorism measures in Yemen, and we believe they may be complicit in abuse there. After our reporting on the abuse in detention centers in the south of the country, the Hadi government set up a committee to investigate, but the UAE has continued to flatly deny any role in detainee abuses. Nevertheless, we know that the abuses continue, most recently documented by a horrific report by the Associated Press of the brutal torture and rape of prisoners. And prisoners have repeatedly started hunger strikes to protest their mistreatment. Yemen and the UAE also have a role in the abuse of migrants from the Horn of Africa. This year, we documented how Yemeni government officials have tortured, raped, and executed migrants and asylum seekers from the Horn of Africa in a detention center in the southern port city of Aden. Authorities have denied asylum seekers, and I know it's hard to imagine, but Yemen is still receiving asylum seekers, an opportunity to seek protection, and deported migrants en masse to dangerous conditions at sea, leading to dozens of drownings just in this year. The Aden Center is under Yemeni government control, but the UAE-backed security belt forces have rounded up, detained, and transported migrants there. We believe the center's former commander is supported by the coalition. We've also documented repeated Houthi violations. Houthis have persistently used banned anti-personnel landmines, which, like cluster munitions, kill and wound civilians long after they have been launched, and hinder the safe return of the displaced and impede humanitarian access. When an area is littered with landmines, humanitarian agencies can't get there, people can't flee from there, and the entire area where landmines have been dropped become killing fields. We documented the use of landmines in 6 governorates that have killed and maimed hundreds, and I should say that this is despite the fact that the Yemeni government, the predecessor government, had actually signed the Convention Against Landmines. A short film here on the use of landmines. I can wrap it up. No problem.
يعني الحوثة لا بارك الله فيهم يعني قاموا بزرع الألغام في مناطق مدنية يعني يضر بها الناس المدنيين ما يضر بها الناس العسكريين.
حادث انفجار سيارة بها 2 أطفال والزوج والحرمة. انتهى الزوج والأطفال انتهوا بقية الحرمة. أجسامهم مقطعة هنا يسار يمين. تم اكتشاف الغام أول نفس الوقت تم اكتشاف 3 ألغام فردية ولهم دبابة. وأنا بس إلا رجلي شوي انقطعت ولا بعضهم بتقطع رجولهم كامل، بعضهم بتشوهوا، تستغربوا ولا بحاجة، بعضهم بتعور عيونهم هذه الألغام.
The Houthis have also persistently launched indiscriminate attacks in Yemeni cities like Taiz, but also into Saudi Arabia. The Houthi Saleh forces have used artillery rockets in dozens of indiscriminate attacks because no party to this conflict actually has clean hands. The Houthis have intensified their use of child soldiers, which is why they also find themselves on the Security Council's list of shame, with some children wounded and killed. The Houthis have forcibly disappeared, arbitrarily detained, and tortured scores of people themselves, including political opponents, human rights activists, journalists, and members of the Baha'i community. And the Houthis also are impeding humanitarian access. The cumulative impact of their obstruction and interference with the delivery of aid has significantly harmed the civilian population. Since I think I've gone over my quota, I'll pause here and invite you to ask me some questions about our recommendations about what to do in this situation and the investigations that have taken place by various parties to the conflict and international organizations as well. Thank you.
Second. Okay, I think so. It's good to be here back again at the same center. I will first, from what we learned even in the morning, is that there are a body of range of international laws and materials that could be applicable or applied to Yemen. That includes complicity, and, as well as abiding and assisting, as well as recklessness. There is also the duty to investigate, and there is also the extraterritorial application of international human rights law, which is still a new developing concept or framework within international law, but still there is room that could apply to the context of Yemen. But since so much of this legal concepts and things have been discussed in the morning too, I want to dive into a new approach in my presentation, is to reflect a little bit about the citizen, the civilian, or like the ordinary individual, who they feel helpless, and they are stuck between two evils, I will say, mainly two evils. One of them, in this one side, is the internationally recognized president who is sleeping in Saudi Arabia and neglecting the abuses and crimes and not taking responsibilities of some forces that are committing some human rights violations in the south. Which also includes groups like Salafis. And also not speaking out or being silent in the face of other countries who are helping him to be reinstalled into power, like the Saudi-led coalition, that's UAE and Saudi Arabia. They have done a lot of mistakes, and there is a lot of mistakes that have hit hospitals, schools, weddings, funerals. So many mistakes after mistake after mistake, and the president and everyone and the international community, a large part of the international community, is still silent about it. The other side is also for the civilian or for the ordinary individual is a ruthless militia group, the Houthis, the armed group, who are brutal to the extent where they blow off the houses of their enemies. There is a lot of enforcibly disappeared people in Yemen. There are also journalists being currently detained for a couple of years since they took over. They did the coup and took over power. There are Taiz, to us in Yemen, is Aleppo of Yemen, in which have been in siege and have been constantly under indiscriminate shelling by the Houthis. Also, some have been mentioned before, is the landmines. That is prohibited internationally, but at the same time have been used extensively within the context of Yemen. And if we look at other places that we may have not even discussed in length today, is the U.S., the role of the U.S. and the Western countries. The U.S. is much more involved than Americans know. And they are not only assisting and abiding the Saudi-led coalition in doing these targeted killings, or sometimes that have been recorded by the UN and human rights organizations to violate international human rights law, but they continue also to sell them billions of arms in billions. Yemenis, they think, why is this still continuing? And if you look at the US role in Yemen, it has started extensively in 2001 in a counterterrorism lens. They see Yemen as a source of threat. And their policies toward Yemen is more of security rather than other forms of policies. They don't invest in Yemen or go into Yemen like what they do in for their neighboring countries. And the Gulf countries, they also look at Yemen as the Mexico of the Gulf. There's always this tendency of making Yemen undermined and having all these international legal frameworks or even sovereignty broken because of weak government, weak leadership, and unaccountability. But if you look at Yemen, to highlight very important historical events when it comes to human rights for Yemen, first I will say is 3 to 4 of them is amnesty or immunity that was granted to former President Ali Abdullah Saleh during the uprising, the 2011 uprising, which was different from a lot of other amnesties that even were given in South America. This amnesty was granted for him in return for ceding power, but the amnesty itself was unconditional. It allowed him to come back to power, to exercise his political role. It allowed him to be a spoiler of peace. And then at that time they were saying, that the regional community and the international community was saying, like, we need to secure stability. We are not worried about justice at the moment. They traded justice for security, but today we lost both. And if you look at, if it was at least conditional, there may have been different scenarios that we have foreseen during the uprising. The other element, or was also shocking for Yemenis, is what have also been mentioned, is naming Saudis as in the Secretary General report, which named and listed Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led coalition in the list of child killers or abusers, the list of shame in the UN. The Saudis in 2016 pressured the UN and the UN Secretary General to take their name off, by even threatening that they will defund a lot of their funding to the UN. And the UN Secretary General did actually take out the name of the Saudis from the list. And you could see how accountability had been obstructed by these political and powerful countries. Yemenis, who can speak out for Yemenis? That's still a question mark. At the same time, there is another incident, is like the efforts for 3 years to establish this international independent commission of inquiry to investigate human rights violations in Yemen. There was a lot of push against it in the international community. And surprisingly, not only the Saudis who were pressuring to stop it and block it, the US and UK and other countries also blocked it from being established. Their fear was about the Saudis. It wasn't fair about the Yemenis themselves. You could see this tendency of neglecting the Yemeni civilian, if you talk about any peace processes or anything, you will question where are their priorities. Is it in Yemen or in their interest around the region? Is it in that's another question that we have to look into. The other one is the non-state actors, like the Houthis. Some new emerging militias are forming in different parts of the country that are very scary. For example, the Salafis in Aden, they targeted youth activists. Some of these detention centers also are run by radical forces under the backing of the UAE. You see this constant and accountability present all the time. And what can we do about this, since the international community doesn't have, or we have not been able as human rights lawyers or activists or anything to use these mechanisms that currently exist, like ICC, the International Commission of Inquiry. They established a panel of experts, an eminent panel of experts that is composed of 3 experts, and its mandate is not as same scope as a commission of inquiry. At the same time, they have very short deadlines to investigate a range of so much violations, so they cannot include them in their investigations. The only hope that we had as Yemenis is that for civil society organizations and NGOs who are documenting these crimes, there may be some hope in the future if there is a responsible government, if there are strong local governing institutions, and even if that these cases may be brought back to the sphere to look at what reparations. Even until today, in the South, the judicial system doesn't function so well. It was 2 months when they started it. A lot of people are imprisoned without any charges, without any knowledge. Similarly, you find that in different areas where the Houthis are controlling. I will say also another reparation or accountability mechanism that we could look into is the role of the U.S. The U.S. have been engaged in drones and counterterrorism in Yemen since 2001. There have been no compensations for civilian victims. There have been a lot of civilian victims on drone. Trump increased the drone so much from Bush, and Trump came and increased it by 3-fold. And still, there are no reparations or compensations for victims, and there are little transparency within the UN system to hold any actors accountable. There were efforts by the U.S. to compensate some victims for the first time recently. For the first Trump raid, you may have heard about. 1 week after he assumed office, there was a ground troops in Yemen that Trump commissioned, and then there were civilians killed, and an American also was killed, and there was efforts to compensate them for the first time. But in our investigation, it turned out that the money didn't go into the families or the victims or the civilians. It went through a channel of corruption and didn't receive it. So at least if there is some sense of transparency or accountability, we could have seen some sense of acknowledgement of the citizens or the Yemenis. I will stop here, and I'll keep the rest of the time for questions, and I'll be happy to answer it.
Thank you very much to all the panelists on this panel and the preceding panelists. We've had a very rigorous day, I would say, but a very good day. And thinking back over what has been said, what I'd like to do for a few minutes is look at the situation in Yemen from the perspective especially of general international law. And I think if we do that, and we take account of the fact of the work that Ambassador Rapp has done in his career, that Rod Dixon is doing now, I think we have to conclude that there is a lot of hard work ahead, but international law and the domestic law of a number of states gives us instruments to use to solve these problems, to begin to solve these problems. What we can't expect the international community to do, unfortunately, we can't expect leadership from the U.S. at this point, or the UK. That can change. We're working very hard as YPP and other international humanitarian groups to cause some change, some more positive approach by U.S. policymakers. But what's ahead of us really is a lot of hard work in a lot of separate and important areas. Everything from work on the Hill with members of Congress, work on people in the administration, not just at the top, but in working levels, work with the United Nations and United Nations entities to bring the story of what's happening in Yemen to a wider audience, and to put it in the context of the protections that international law provides. So I'd like to touch on several specific points. And the first is that the international law applicable to the Yemen situation is a very well-developed body of law. It's not soft law. It's law that exists as a result of international agreements, widely adhered to throughout the community of sovereign states. It exists as a result of decisions of international criminal tribunals. The law has been codified in many ways, and the law is being implemented in many situations. Not universally, obviously, but we would like to see the situation in Yemen increasingly explored in terms of international prohibitions and the rights that arise if those are violated. So the law is a very useful instrument. Secondly, there are certain important aspects of the law that applies to the Yemen situation. And one of the most important is that international crimes of the sort that are being committed in Yemen don't simply involve the responsibility of states, as is the case generally with international law. Individual human beings that commit crimes and those to which they report in their chain of command are liable for criminal sanctions. And that is a very important aspect of this situation that needs attention, certainly of the wider interested community, but also of the U.S. government. The U.S. government is putting individual human beings in a situation where they are committing war crimes of the most serious type, and these individuals will suffer the consequences throughout their lives. Next, I think it's very important, and you've heard about some of these efforts already, that unlike many other situations where international criminal law and international humanitarian law and state responsibility law, many situations where an international tribunal or commission gets to work, as Ambassador Rapp and others have said, as we have found in our work in the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission, you go into a situation a few years after the conclusion of hostilities and you're faced by an immense problem of evidence, lack of evidentiary quality evidence. But in the situation of Yemen, we do have a number of operations and activities underway, and I'll come back to those in a few minutes. And finally, of course, we need to take up the question of how can the impact of the law and the impact of the evidence of violations of the law be applied in this situation so that impunity is discouraged, is prevented, and reparations and recovery is advanced. I think it might be helpful for me to simply list in relatively formal language the war crimes that have been committed and are being committed in the Yemen conflict. And I'm looking solely here at the period between mid-March 2015 and the present and the continuing present. But these are the war crimes that are actually being committed day after day, and crimes against humanity. Attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless objects that are indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, including foodstuffs, agricultural areas for food production, crops, livestock, drinking water installations and irrigation work, medicines and medical supplies. Refusing to allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians. Attacks against civilians and indiscriminate attacks of a nature likely to strike military and civilian objects without distinction. Collective punishments. Killing of one or more persons as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population. Violence aimed at spreading terror among the civilian population. And aiding and abetting all of these above. Now, I haven't listed every single war crime or violation of international law that is characteristic of the Yemen situation, but the ones I've listed are the gravest, the most internationally abhorrent crimes, and these are continuing in a widespread and systematic way. It causes one to wonder, what is the Saudi-led coalition's strategy in Yemen? They're not on the ground. They're not in a position to take over or implement an occupation. The evidence suggests, and I simply say suggests because we're not trying to prove things here, but it suggests that as a means of getting the Houthis to relinquish control to a government that is situated in Riyadh or elsewhere, in order to do that, the strategy is to inflict maximum pain on the civilian population of Yemen. And that, of course, is a severe war crime. And that's only part of the reason that this is a losing strategy. The civilian of pain on the imposition of pain on the civilian population is imposing pain on people who have no ability to change their own government. And so the more of it you do, in effect, you probably are strengthening the Houthi control of the country. So war crime, ineffective strategy. However, I think one of the things that is positive about the current situation in Yemen is that there is really a significant effort to collect information, to collect facts, and this is going on as we speak. You've heard from one of the most effective international humanitarian organizations, Human Rights Watch today, Amnesty International, the International Rescue Committee, the International Committee of the Red Cross. There is a very large group of organizations led by the United Nations, which is constantly collecting information from a very widespread network of experts in the field in Yemen and organizing that information. So we're information on the impact on the civilian population, right down to the number of people subject to starvation, subject to cholera epidemics. The evidence is something that many of us who worked on these cases would have given anything to have access to when we were beginning to put cases before a commission or assess criminal and civil responsibility. So to me, that's a bright spot. The law and the strength of the law and the comprehensive coverage of what's going on in Yemen in international law and indeed in domestic law of a number of states is it's there and ready. The evidence is being prepared. And so what has to happen for this evidence to be properly employed? I think all of us who have the ability to talk to our governing authorities, to contribute funds to efforts being made to cause congressional resistance in the form of weapons sales, in the form of resistance to presidential authority without congressional consent to declare war. All of these activities are going on, and I would urge everybody to pay attention to what's going on. The website of the Yemen Peace Project, yemenpeaceproject.org, is a good way to keep up with what's happening both in areas of advocacy before the U.S. government and also ways in which you can make your own views felt. Now, when we get to the question of accountability, of course it falls into two different areas. Accountability of individuals, and we've talked and heard a lot about this morning war crimes and criminal trials and criminal processes. There's also the very important aspect of responsibility of states. And international law is quite clear on the question of state responsibility when a state has violated international law to repair the damage that has been done. To some extent, what we have here is a question of tactics. Looking broadly, historically, we can think of what was done at the end of the First World War with respect to reparations imposed upon the German state and other states that were defeated. On the other hand, we can think of the Marshall Plan, which was undertaken to repair the defeated countries and to allow their economies to develop. And I think both of these paths have to be pursued. I'm happy to say that there is already some work underway. Walid's group and others have started looking at what needs to be done in order to recover in Yemen from the terrible conflict. And so we need to start thinking about what the needs are. We need to start thinking about how activities can be organized so that the recovery doesn't cause more problems than the war itself. So this is the work that's before us. And we invite all of you to, those of you, many of you are already involved in it. We invite all of you to consider how you could participate. Thank you
very much. Questions? We have some time. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kate Kaiser. I'm at Win Without War. So, you know, I think your panel, as well as many other the panels earlier, acknowledged the role of the international community in stopping these accountability mechanisms from moving forward in the international arena. And so I'm just wondering, like, what are the other options for, like, prosecutions outside the UN system, as it seems like we might need to be creative there?
No, you go ahead. Have a start.
I'll ask Rod to join my comments, but I certainly think support should be given to the committee of eminent experts that has been established by the Human Rights Council. And while there are deficiencies in what they're authorized to do, I think I might have here a statement of their mandate. It was to inform the UN and the public on all alleged violations and abuses of international human rights and other appropriate and applicable fields of international law committed by all parties to the conflict since September 2014, and to establish the facts and circumstances surrounding the alleged violations and abuses and, where possible, to identify those responsible. So this is a starting point, and more support should be given to this effort. Then I think we also have to be creative, and groups of Yemenis and interested international organizations, especially those in the U.S. and the UK, are already and should be intensifying their efforts to come up with their own creative solutions to how to stage and accomplish a recovery.
I would only add that people do travel around a lot more these days, including from countries like Yemen on all sides, and under universal jurisdiction provisions in the laws of different countries, it is possible, even if the crimes are not committed there, by nationals from those countries to look to investigate and arrest those persons. Even the investigation itself, which can be public, can serve as a deterrent. Of course, in most cases, people do have to be there, but that is a system of law which we shouldn't overlook. It's developed through, as was being said, the black letter law of the Geneva Conventions into the ICC, with a lot of countries adopting that legislation, and then also the Torture Convention and other universal jurisdiction provisions. But that's why when people were discussing earlier what the nature of the conflict is, it's quite important, because if it's an international conflict, then the grave breaches which go back to 1949 apply in a lot of countries, and people can be prosecuted potentially if they step foot in those countries. And of course, there is nevertheless the will within those countries to take forward these cases. But we've seen a few examples of this in certain places, like in relation to Syria, prosecutions in Germany, one or two in the UK, some here in the US. There are also civil options in the US as well. And with sufficient evidence and the right connections, these cases can be brought and put a lot of pressure on the national systems to respond. Yes, I didn't.
I'm Marjorie Ransom. I served twice in Yemen as a diplomat, and I hope that as you list the crimes that have been committed against Yemen, that you include the deliberate targeting of irreplaceable archaeological sites, which are an important resource of Yemen.
Any comments on that or the last?
Last one?
Yeah. No, I'll take two more questions.
Yes, from a Yemeni perspective, it's unfortunate. Usually, even after... Oh, sorry. Can you turn this on? Yes, it's unfortunate from a Yemeni perspective, because even after World War II, victors determine who is going to be punished. This is unfortunate. And ultimately, yes, the Houthis will lose, and they could be mechanisms, but also the other tools that have been established after World War II in different countries. For example, these frameworks could still work if there is seriousness from the international community in using the records of these commissions and inquiries.
Okay, maybe just take 2 or 3 more questions, and then you can just answer them all together to try and get as many done in the last few minutes. Okay, one over here, one there, and then one at the back there. The last 3. Is there one here as well? Yeah, I'll try that.
Thank you all for your amazing work and presentations. I'm Rachel Carrillo, the United Nations Association of Boulder County, Colorado. My question's for Sarah. The last, or the very first speaker who was on teleconference had mentioned kind of the uselessness of social media and investigations. And I'm wondering, with Human Rights Watch, how your investigators feel. Is it helping, or is it a hindrance? Is there, I would just like perspective on that. Thank you.
Okay, then.
Well, I had a similar question, but Kate Gould, I'm with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Thank you all for this very important panel. And I also had a question for Sarah, just to, I know you mentioned, you invited us to ask you more about Human Rights Watch's policy recommendations, and I'm sure they're tied to the last question, but would love to hear more about that.
And then one there, and then one here. Was there one that side? Here. Okay. And then here.
What is the status of the UAE under the international law? Because when the coalition intervened, the Yemeni Authority asked Saudi Arabia, they did not ask Emirates. And if you followed the Associated Press report like a week ago about the systematic sexual torture. Emirates mission in Geneva said that they do not run any of these prison or detention facilities, and they are run by Yemeni authorities, not the Yemeni government, but the Yemeni authorities. So what does this mean under international law? They are owned by the Emirates. They are the ones who support the authorities, which are the militias, but they decline that they are the ones who are. So I don't know. I'm a bit confused of the status of Emirates and what they're doing.
Okay, then one last question here.
Hi, I'm Marta. I'm the Arms Division Associate at Human Rights Watch. My question is about the rhetoric and the vocabulary that's used when information about this conflict is presented to Western policymakers and the public, and how that differs from Arabic language press.
Okay, final comments. We have 2 minutes. Have the sign.
Yeah, I will sadly therefore have to almost be cryptic in my response to the questions that were asked. But I would say, and just tying back to the discussions earlier, that I would urge everybody to think of accountability very, very broadly. Because even while judicial accountability, sort of the gold standard of how we think of accountability classically, exists, the chances of it actually happening are very, very tiny. But the other forms of accountability, the reputational accountability, the accountability the record of truth creates, the accountability of pressure on social media, can also exact a toll and a cost. And I would say that for example, Saudi coalition's establishment of an investigative body is completely 100% result of the pressure that has been brought on the international coalition for its crimes due to the court of public opinion, where fortunately we have been able to get truth and facts out, relying in large part, of course, on social media, but on regular journalistic establishments as well. I mean, the lines are very blurred. The cost of that, of course, you could just measure in the dollars that have been spent on PR firms by various parties to the coalitions, all of which I would submit have been flushed down the toilet because the reputation of the Saudi coalition has taken a very, very big hit because of their conduct, first and foremost, but because of the exposure of that conduct. So it's, like I said, it's not the satisfaction one would have in seeing abusers who indiscriminately attack children and schools and drop cluster bombs on Sana'a University and so forth, sitting behind bars. But it is a very powerful accountability that we in the public have got a hold of and need to continue to keep a hold of as part of our arsenal. And so part and parcel of that is using the information that we're able to expose, using the social shock and disgust at realizing that these are American weapons or British weapons that are being dropped on the heads of Yemeni children, maiming them, crippling them for life. That has resulted in these actions to suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia. This is just unheard of, and it is 100% the result of civil society activism, Yemeni civil society activism, international civil society activism that has actually managed in Germany, in the Netherlands, to produce arms embargoes. Very costly ones for these governments because, the Saudi and the UAE are the cash cows of the planet in terms of arms purchases, #1 and #4 largest weapons purchasers in the world. But even here in the United States, where the U.S. military-industrial complex is literally at the teat of the petrodollars from Saudi and UAE, the U.S. Senate came close to passing a resolution to embargo arms sales, and the review of the conduct of the U.S. role in that war continues to be something that even the beleaguered, weak Democrats in Congress continue to demand. So, if anything, I would say there's a lot to feel good about in that the international community, civil society, the Yemeni victims have been able to extract some cost and punishment for all of the abusers in this war.
That's the perfect way to end. We're going to have to wrap it up because we have to leave now. It's obviously an issue we could go on discussing for so long. And thank you very much to the speakers for your eye-opening insights. We've all learned so much throughout the conference, and in particular this panel. So thank you so much. And I also just want to thank our host, Simpson, and all of the various people who've supported us in making this happen today with the live streaming, and those who have sponsored it as well. And thank you to all of you for coming. We have a Facebook page and Twitter. So in terms of broader accountability and how you keep the focus up, it's the perfect place to go. There'll be further documents kept there, and we hope to keep it going as a way of ensuring that the issue remains prominently in focus. So please keep following, and thank you again for making the time today.